Hi, Bryson.
Hey, James. My question was on your interpretation of Hebrews 10:29. I was watching your debate with Trent Horn, where he went to this text and he was trying to get you to answer who the he was that was sanctified. And he pointed out in your book that you said that he was Jesus. So he was trying to stumble you up by saying that, well, Jesus can't be the one that's sanctified because Jesus sanctifies believers, and Jesus himself is obviously not a believer. And then he pulled up the Thomas Schreiner quote where Schreiner disagrees with you. And I just wanted to ask you a question on, like, what made you come to that conclusion? Because I know you didn't get enough time in the cross-examination to really flesh it out, to be able to respond to him maybe in a way that you may have wanted to. So I wanted to ask why do you think that he in Hebrews 10:29 is Jesus and not a believer?
Well, the best way to answer that is to direct you to the sermons in the series on Hebrews. I did 80 sermons through the book of Hebrews that are on the sermon audio website at the PRBC website. The sermon series is still posted there. And if you could just do the Hebrews 10 sermons. There were multiple sermons, but fundamentally, I pointed out that while it's a minority position, when you have people like John Owen in your camp, you can sort of go, whatever. I'm not worried about the minority so much as the consistency in the understanding of what is being stated in Hebrews chapter 10. Fundamentally, if you say that by which he was sanctified, so if you take as the object of hagiasthē, the person who deserves punishment, you are introducing a fundamental contradiction in Hebrews chapter 10, which is the climax of the apologetic argumentation of the book of Hebrews. I mean, you from chapter 10, you go into the faith chapter, and then beginning in chapter 12 into the practical application. So this is for the book of Hebrews. This is the Romans 8 of the book of Romans. This is the pinnacle. This is where you're fundamentally establishing the argument of the epistle, which is there's nothing to go back to. And so up to this point, the argument back in chapter 10, verses 10 through 14, was the perfection of the one-time sacrifice of Christ over against the repeated sacrifices of the Old Covenant, which could not bring about perfection. But verses 10 through 14 make it very plain that the work of Christ has as its outcome the intention that the triune God intended that action to have. And so if you go a few verses later, and literally a matter of sentences later, and say, well, yeah, but I'm going to use the same terminology here, and I'm going to apply it to the person who denies Christ. Not only are you going against the pattern that we saw back in Hebrews chapter 6, where you have this strong warning section, but then it's followed by, we are convinced of better things concerning you, things which accompany salvation, and then Christ has entered as your forerunner into the holy place. We have an anchor for the soul, and Jesus represents us, and have all the rest of that stuff there in Hebrews chapter 6. Well, if you go to Hebrews chapter 10, you've sort of got the same thing, but in reverse. You have the promises first, and then you have this warning section in light of that. And there's no question, I mean, what's in view here is the person who would go back. It's the person who would offer sacrifices. One of the reasons why it's plain that the book of Hebrews is written prior to the destruction of the temple in AD 70 is there has to be a way for this to have been a temptation at the time, was to go back, offer sacrifice, curse Christ, trample underfoot the blood of the Son of God, all the rest of these things. There were people who did that. Well, what was their state? What was their condition? And if you take the idea that, yeah, they were perfected in Hebrews chapter 10, and then the work of the Messiah is undone by their actions, the fundamental argument of the supremacy and superiority of Christ to all the old covenant is destroyed at the very climax of the epistle. And I just go, I and John Owen and others go, no, I don't think that's what the final argument is going to be. No one can argue that on Greek grammatical grounds, hagiaste can have either Christ or the apostate as its subject. That's not even a question. The question is, what is consistent with the argument of the epistle? And what's interesting to me is I can understand why a Roman Catholic who doesn't believe the death of Christ has ever perfected anybody, and doesn't see that the repeated argument of the epistle, one time, they don't have a one time. They have a over and over and over, never perfecting sacrifice. They're in the position of the Jews. I can understand why they're not going to get the book of Hebrews. But Reformed people who have an understanding of the union of the elect with Christ and the fact that his death is our death, our union with Christ in his death, I would think that we would be the first ones to recognize what's really going on here. But especially those in the Federal Vision movement are big on emphasizing that other reading of Hebrews chapter 10, which leads to some I think, fundamental departures from historic Reformed understanding of the perfection of the work of Christ and the true meaning of substitution and things like that. We won't go into new perspectivism or anything like that, or the Federal Vision and stuff like that right here. So for me, it's simple consistency. My theory is the book of Hebrews is a sermon preached by the Apostle Paul that was translated into Greek. It was preached by Paul in Aramaic Hebrew and was translated by Luke into Greek. That explains the form that it has. And for the Apostle Paul to shoot himself in the head, metaphorically speaking, at the very climax of his argument, in making application in the warning passage, just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So grammatically, it is perfectly possible to read it in either direction, and then theologically then, when you talk about the blood of the covenant, having just finished the whole discussion of the Son of God who took on flesh. In fact, interestingly enough, if you go back to Hebrews 10, 10:5, the writer has specifically cited a textual variant from the Greek Septuagint to emphasize the body given by Jesus that brings about the sanctification of those for whom he dies. If you're familiar with it, a body you have prepared for me, in the Hebrew, it's something about boring out an ear, for hearing purposes. And it's pretty obvious that the writer is choosing the Greek Septuagint reading specifically to emphasize that sacrificial language of a body and the giving of that body. And so if that's such a strong element of the argumentation that then in verses 10 through 14 is, by the one-time offering of the body, there it is. Then you get down to 29 and all of a sudden go, yeah, but the blood of the covenant here it's not the one who gave that blood and his body and his being sanctified as high priest. No, it's now we're going to say it's the one who is the apostate, and therefore we can say that apostates were actually sanctified and they were set apart, and so they have to be part of the sacrificial purpose and the whole nine yards. I find it utterly inconsistent. with the whole argument of the epistle. So that's where I go with it. And if someone wants to go, well, but tactically in a debate, I don't care. Debates are not what determine the truth. The whole counsel of God is what determines the truth. And if the truth of a text takes too long to be able to express in a debate, well, so be it. I'm gonna assume that God's gonna continue building His kingdom one way or the other. It doesn't matter how the debate goes.
Right. That's why I wanted to call and get a fuller explanation, since I know that you didn't have a lot of time in the cross-examination.
Well, that is one of the problems, let's be honest, with debates is technically, that kind of thing shouldn't be brought up in that context. I mean, the actual rule is that you bring up your arguments in your opening statement, and then you flesh those things out, and however far you get should delimit the area of discussion after that. That's never how it happens. It's never how it happens, unfortunately. But technically, it's not supposed to happen. All righty?
Well, okay. Well, I was going to try to slip a quick question in there.
All right, real quick.
Maybe it's not as quick. All right. So in the chat, they were talking about, what's going to happen with Western civilization in light of postmodernism and various things like that. What would you say, if you could name one thing or two things or whatever, would be the biggest danger to the church in Western culture, whether this is prosperity gospel or lack of proper church discipline or discipleship? What would you say would be the biggest danger to the church that we have in 2018 and going forward?
Well, first of all, you gave me a crick in the neck because we changed direction so fast. And so I'm going to have to see my chiropractor after this. I assumed what you meant was a short follow-up question on the first one, but now everybody else in line for calls really doesn't like you anymore, so I'd be careful. Your name was Bob, right? Okay. Anyway, I actually, though, I've answered this question numerous times, and it really came up in the last call too. I think that the greatest danger to the church in 2018 obviously is going to be dependent upon where you are. I don't think the greatest danger to the church in the United States is the same thing as the greatest danger to the church in South Africa or Uganda or China. Obviously, each one of those contexts is going to be different. In South Africa, there's just this massive amount of false teaching and the prosperity gospel and the absolute foolishness of what goes on there. China, it's obvious. The Chinese communists are doubling down on establishing absolute totalitarianism and mind control. In the United States, it is obviously the rise of secular totalitarianism, the destruction of the ability of the church to openly and plainly teach God's truth. It's coming. We will lose access to public spheres. We're losing it right now. We're seeing on university. If you want to see the future of the culture, look at the university campuses. Right now, Christians do not have freedom of expression and thought in those contexts. They're already being suppressed. Clubs getting kicked off campus. If you say we only want to have Christians in our club, nope, got to be able to have homosexual Muslims in your club. This type of absolute insanity. We can look at all sorts of other things in the sense of degradation of view of the inspiration of Scripture, all things like that. But fundamentally, in the church, when you have people who are hardcore secularists coming into the church, we have to be challenging that secular mindset. And I just don't see that a lot of churches are really doing that and preparing people along those lines. So that's probably what I would say along that line there. Thank you very much for your call today, Bryson. Hope you found that to be